Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi wa ba'd. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Welcome everyone to another session of Monday Night Boost. And for tonight we're going to do things a bit differently. Sorry about that. All right. So we're going to be doing things a bit differently tonight. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be speaking about the funeral rites in Islam, specifically pertaining to the situation that we're in right now. As you guys know, that there's over 1,000 people, I believe, that have passed away in New York State, and many of them are Muslims, and these people have passed away from the COVID-19 virus. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant all of the Muslims shahada, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give shifa to all of the Muslims who are, or to all of the people for that matter, that are afflicted with this terrible disease. We have to understand that this is something that has affected people in our communities as well. It's not just people that are far away. Rather, Queens, our locality is one of the worst places for this virus. So, I urge myself and for everyone that we take the most serious of precautions to protect ourselves as well as our families. So today, inshallah ta'ala, as I mentioned, it's a bit different today as opposed to our normal Monday Night Boost sessions. We're taking a break for today from speaking about the lives of the prophets. And today we're going to talk about some of the ahkam that have to do with the janazah. So under normal circumstances, a lot of us, we're familiar with what to do with a person that has passed away in terms of the janazah rituals. But what do we do when someone has passed away from this virus and the doctors tell us that it's too dangerous for someone to be exposed to the body? How then can you wash the body? How then can you shroud the body? How then can you pray over the body? Right? If you don't have access to the body, what should you do? What if the family members are not able to go see the person or to make sure that the Islamic guidelines are being followed? What do we do in that circumstance? What do we do about the burial? All right, let's say the authorities, because of the amount of people that are dying, they want to cremate the bodies. I think this is being done in some countries. What do we do in circumstances like that? How can we guarantee that the Muslims are being taken care of in terms of the funeral rites? This is something that's very important. So first of all, let's start off this discussion by setting a principle, all right, by laying down a principle, and that is the funeral rites in Islam to wash the body of the dead Muslim, to shroud their body, to pray the janazah over them, and to bury them. This is all from the furudul kifaya, right? It's from the obligations that if a group of Muslims take up this obligation and they fulfill these rites, then the sin or the burden of fulfilling these rites are lifted from the entire community. So I'll give you guys an example. When someone dies in our community, right? Is it an obligation for every single Muslim to wash the body? No. Is it an obligation for every single Muslim to leave what they're doing and to pray the janazah for that person? No. Is it recommended? Of course, right? It's recommended for the general public to do that, but the obligation is lifted from the community if just a few people do it, or even if one person does it, for example. All right. So we've spoken about the washing, we've spoken about the shrouding, the janazah. Also for the burial, is it an obligation for every single Muslim to bury a person that has died? No, right? As long as a few Muslims have done this already, then that fulfills the obligation for on behalf of the entire community, right? So let's just set that clearly. Let's just set that clear, because there are a lot of organizations, alhamdulillah, right? Funeral parlors, a lot of funeral organizations, Muslim organizations that are really working hard to make sure that Muslims are being taken care of in terms of their funeral rites. Okay, so I just want to mention that so that we understand that this is not an obligation on every single person. And sometimes you may not be able to do what you want to do with your deceased relative. For example, someone may want to wash their deceased relative, right? You may not be able to do that because perhaps you're not trained to deal with these bodies, right? To basically, you're not trained to wear the proper equipment or to do all of the procedures that the funeral services do. So you may not even be able to see the body, right? So we have to understand that, the first point that I want to mention to us is that we get the guidance from the authorities, right? Get the guidance from those who have knowledge about how to deal with this situation. And like I said, that of course I'm referring to the janazah services and the funeral homes, okay? Because this is something for a lot of them, they've been doing this already, right? Muslims have been dying, for whatever reason for forever, right? And these are the people that normally take care of this, all right? So it's no different when it comes to this situation. So the first point of advice is that just get the advice and assistance and guidance from those who deal with this. Okay, sometimes what may happen is that someone may act on emotions, and then they may cause certain problems to happen, right? We want to make sure that we're doing things calmly, right? And that we're following guidelines that we're supposed to be following legally and of course Islamically. The second point that I want to mention is that we have to make sure that in Islam, when a Muslim dies, the body must be washed. Right? We've just addressed that the body must be washed. Now, what if it comes to the point where we're not able to wash the body of a Muslim who dies from the coronavirus, right? And this has happened because I believe many of the medical authorities they've stated that a person who dies from this, they can still transmit the virus. And one of the ways that this virus is transmitted, and you guys can do your own research on this from the medical authorities, is that it spreads through the water droplets, right? From the droplets of moisture, for example, mucus and things like that. That's why it's spreading all over. That's why we have to wash our hands. All right. That's why we have to just stay away from each other. I believe it's 6 feet, right, away from the other person, because sometimes they may sneeze or they may breathe or they may speak to you, and a droplet of spit may come out, and that may touch your body, come in contact with you, and then the virus can spread via those droplets. So the same goes for washing a Muslim who has passed away. Sometimes a person may be infected with this virus and they've passed away, and when a person tries to wash the body, all of the water basically spreads that virus. So I believe that many of the medical authorities, they've stated that washing, I believe the World Health Organization as well, that when it comes to washing the body, this can spread through washing the body, right? So in the case where it's not possible to wash the body, what do we do as Muslims in that scenario? Do we just bury the person, right? Or is there something else, something else that we can do? In the case where the body cannot be washed, if you have the access to throw water over the body, right, or to basically pour water over the body from a distance, however far the distance is, if you're able to pour water over the body, then that would suffice, right? Normally, the body must be fully washed, right? And the people that take care of the washing, they normally, of course, they use gloves, but they make sure that the water gets everywhere. If that's not possible, then at least pour water over the body, right? So the first thing that we should be doing is that we should be washing the body. If that's not possible, which in this situation it's not, if we're able to pour water over the body, that's what we should do. All right. If any one of you are in this situation where you're washing someone, then if it's possible to basically pour water over the body, this is what should be done. If there's harm in washing, if it's not possible for water to be poured over the body, for example, let's say because the medical authorities, they've forbidden the person from doing that, right? Or let's say, for example, the body is in a sealed bag, right? Or let's say, for example, we just don't have any access to the person. What should be done then, right? If we have access to the body as well and we can't use water, right? If we have access to the body and we can't use water, then tayammum can be done. Right, there's many scholars that have mentioned that when a person is deceased and the washing is not possible, if there's dirt available, then that can be used. All right. Now, in the situation where the body is completely sealed off in a bag, then of course, tayammum cannot possibly be done. All right. So in that situation, the scholars have mentioned that the body can be buried as is. And this is only because of the harm that would come about if a person comes into contact with that body. All right, so let's just mention those steps one more time. Number one, if you're able to wash the body, that should be done. Number two, if that's not possible, at least pour water over the body. Right. Number three, if water cannot be used because of the harm, then tayammum can be done. And in an extreme case where a person is not able to do any of these, then the body must be buried, right? It's not permissible to delay the burial and to leave the person out. Rather, they should be buried, all right? And we have to understand that do not feel that if there's a loved one or if there's a family member that for example, it wasn't able for them to be washed. It wasn't possible for them to be washed, or even tayammum was not possible to be done. Then don't think that they are being buried and an Islamic obligation has not been fulfilled for them, right? Rather, this is a situation of necessity, right? This is a situation of necessity, and of course, this will, inshallah ta'ala, will not lead to any issues for them in their akhirah, right? We have to make sure that we're clear on that. Now, in terms of the kafan, for example, in terms of wrapping the body of the dead, normally they have to be wrapped in those white sheets. But what if we're not able to do that? As long as they're being covered with something, and I'm sure that the authorities will have these bodies covered with something. Okay, as long as they're covered with something, then this will suffice. And in most cases, it's going to be like a bag, a sealed bag, for example. All right, and a person can be buried in that state. Okay, and like I said, this is perhaps only because of the necessity of that. All right. So the next point is that how should Salat al-Janazah be done? Let's say, for example, you don't have any access to the body, you don't find out until for example, they're ready to bury the body. What do you do in terms of Salat al-Janazah? What if Salat al-Janazah has already been prayed for your deceased family member? Right? Can you pray another Salat al-Janazah? So the scholars mentioned that Salat al-Janazah, right, as I've mentioned, is a fardu kifaya. As long as a few people do it, then it suffices the entire community of the obligation. It doesn't need to be done anymore. However, there are many scholars who do say that a person can pray Salat al-Janazah for someone who's been prayed over already. So an example of this is, let's say, for example, the funeral service, they've done a Salat al-Janazah, right? They've done a Salat al-Janazah for the deceased Muslim. And you, as a family member, the family members have not prayed it. Is that permissible? Many scholars, they've mentioned that it's permissible to do that. So what you can do is that you can gather the family in the house and you could pray Salat al-Janazah as you normally do. All right? And we have to make sure that Salat al-Janazah is done, right? Try to find out about your family members if it was done, and you can even do it yourself with your family members in the home. And another point to mention as well is that it is permissible to do Salat al-Janazah in the graveyard. All right, in the graveyard. This was done by the Sahaba, and there's no issue. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what he forbade is from taking the graves as masajid. Right. So how do we reconcile between that hadith where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he invoked Allah's curse against people that pray in graves, that take the graveyards as places of worship, as masajid, as masjids. So how do we reconcile between that and the fact that the Sahaba prayed at the graveyard, right? The Sahaba only prayed Salatul Janazah at the graveyard. Now, Salatul Janazah, if you guys have prayed Salatul Janazah before, you know that there's no ruku' or there's no sujood in Salatul Janazah. So a masjid is literally a place where you make sujood, hence the name masjid. Right? I'm pretty sure it sounds very similar to you right now, right? Sujood, making prostration, and masjid. Masjid in the Arabic language literally means a place of sujood, a place of prostration. So has a person that has prayed Salatul Janazah in a graveyard, have they taken the graveyard as a masjid? No, because there's no sujood in there. All right? So generally speaking, can you pray Salatul Dhuhr in a graveyard? The answer is no. Right? You should not do that. Can you pray Salatul Asr, Maghrib, Isha, or any Salah, you want to pray Witr, Tarawih, whatever, right? The answer is no. You can't pray those salawat in the graveyard, all right? But you can pray Salatul Janazah as there's no sujood in that Salah. So, for example, if Salatul Janazah has not been done for the person and they're about to be buried, for example, can you pray Salatul Janazah at the graveyard? The answer is yes. Okay, so if you ever witness the burial of one of your loved ones, and even if there wants to be another, you guys want to do like another Salatul Janazah there, then there's no problem with that. Okay, so I want to make that clear, inshallah. And a lot of these ahkam that I've mentioned, they've been already established by a lot of the fiqh councils in the U.S. and in other countries as well. All right, so you could, of course, you could do a lot more reading on this issue as well, and you'll find a lot of the same conclusions that these scholars have mentioned. All right, now, so another issue that we want to address as well is that in the situation where, for example, let's say someone wants to film the burial, right? Is that permissible? Someone wants to have a video of their loved one being lowered into the ground, for example, or they want to, have it on video so they can make sure that things have been done properly. Then there's nothing wrong with that, right? Of course, as long as Islamic guidelines of dress and things like that um, are fulfilled, and those things should be done anyway. All right. Now, what about the situation where multiple bodies have to be buried in one grave? Let's say this goes to a point where multiple bodies have to be buried into one grave. Is that something permissible Islamically? Now, this happened during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? After the Battle of Uhud, Sahaba, 2 or 3 at a time, would be buried in one grave because of the space, right? So in a situation like this that we're in right now, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows how worse it's going to get, or if it's even going to get any worse. And looking at the trend, of course, if anybody is following the news and you're following the numbers, it doesn't even seem as if it's peaked yet, right? The numbers have peaked yet. So this is a very difficult situation. And if it comes to the point where a Muslim, a few Muslims at a time must be buried in one grave, Allahu alam, even if the authorities would even allow that, but let's say they allow that, right? Would that be permissible Islamically? Yes. The Prophet ﷺ had that done with those Sahaba who passed away in the battle. All right. Now, another thing that we have to make sure that we understand as well in terms of the ahkam of the janaiz, is that we have to make sure. Many of the scholars have mentioned ijma' on this, that there's consensus, that there's no difference of opinion among the jurists that a Muslim who passes away must be buried in the graveyard of the Muslims. They must be buried along with other Muslims who have passed away in the same graveyard. Now, in the situation where that is not possible, the scholars have mentioned that this is the general rule unless there's a necessity. So sometimes, for example, let's say there are so many people dying, right? The graveyards are becoming very crowded, and they need to bury a Muslim in a place that is the graveyard of non-Muslims. Would that be permissible in that situation? The scholars have mentioned that if it's out of necessity, it's, if there's nowhere for this person to be buried, then it's permissible for them to be buried in that place. And you have to realize, I want to keep reiterating this, that we are in different times, right? Things are very different right now. We're not doing things as we normally do because of the circumstances. So we have to realize that if there's a loved one that has passed away, right, we have to realize that if these things, if they don't get the opportunity to be buried among Muslims, right, or if they don't get the washing done as is normally done, right? If there's any special circumstance like this, we have to realize that inshallah ta'ala this will not carry on and harm them in the akhirah. These are only things that are being done out of necessity and to protect others. We have to realize that there's a principle in our legal system that says la darar wa la dirar, right? That ad-dararu yuzal, that harm should be avoided at all costs, right? Harm should be avoided at all costs. And this is a virus that could lead to death as well. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ, and do not kill yourselves. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbids us in other places in the Quran from throwing ourselves into destruction. Right? So this is something that's clear in Islam, that if we're going to do something that's going to cause harm to ourselves, then we have to make sure that we're protecting ourselves. And that includes washing the dead. That includes burying the dead. So all these special circumstances that are being these special precautions that are being taken when it comes to the janaza procedures, we have to understand that these are only things that are being done to protect ourselves from harm. And that's what our Sharia, that's what our legal system obligates upon us, right? That we protect ourselves as much as possible. Now, one thing I do want to mention as well, and this is another point, and that is that cremation must be avoided at all costs. There's some countries, I believe, that they are cremating some of the bodies of the deceased from this virus. All right, just because of the amount of people that are dying, and perhaps they don't have space in in the graveyards or whatever the case is. Right, we have to make sure that as Muslims, we have to try our best to make sure that the Muslims get buried the way that Islam is the way that Islam commands them to be buried, right? And that is to have a normal burial, for them to be buried into the ground, into the dirt, right? And we have to try as much as possible not to let it get to a point where Muslims are being cremated, their bodies are being cremated. All right. Now, if that, if it comes to a point where that's outside of our control, then, I guess in that situation, what are we going to do, right? Especially if the authorities, if they, but to be honest, I think that there are some countries that have made this exception for Muslims, right? Or, and for people of faiths that require them to be buried similar to ours. All right, so inshallah ta'ala, I don't think that this is an issue yet, and hopefully inshallah ta'ala it's not going to get to that extent. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect all of us. I mean, something else that I want to discuss. So this is just a basic summary of the rulings of the janaiz, right, in the times of the coronavirus. Now we have to realize that everything should remain the same. Everything that is being done, the dua that you make for the dead, the way that you pray Salatul Janazah, everything should remain the same. All right? Nothing should be different. All right? The only things that we should change are the things that the medical experts have advised us to change because of the harm. Right? And one thing I want to make very clear is that we should be seeking the guidance of these medical authorities. Yes, they may not be Muslims, some of them may be Muslims, and they may not be scholars of Islam, but we have to realize that these matters, this virus is not an Islamic virus. All right, of course we have ahkam of how to deal with it from an Islamic perspective in terms of the Jum'ah, in terms of the salawat being postponed. Can we do that, right? Can we close the masjids? Those things, as scholars talk about those things. But what you find is that when it comes to matters of health, for example, we must stick to the advice of the authorities. All right, many times, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us understanding. We may find things on social media, right? Strange remedies. All right, we have to be very careful with these things. There's some remedies that you guys are going to find online that are harmful to you, that are not prescribed by medical authorities. So we have to make sure that when it comes to the medical side of things, the do's and don'ts in terms of the medical point of view, we have to make sure that we're going by the guidelines of the medical authorities. All right, and knowing that information, then we can translate that into how we deal with these matters from an Islamic perspective. So when they tell us that it's going to be harmful to wash the body, then we move to an alternative, and that's tayammum. If that's going to be harmful from a medical perspective, then we move to basically just burying the body as is, because it's not possible for us to have any contact with the body. So we have to make sure that we're taking the advice of the experts, the medical experts, so that we're not speaking about matters without knowledge. All right, and that's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbids in the Quran, right? وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, do not pursue that which you have no knowledge about. So in Islam, it's not permissible for somebody to delve into matters and they have no knowledge about the matter that they're delving into, right? And perhaps harm may be caused because of that. We know the famous statement of Imam al-Bukhari where he says, "Al-ilmu qabla al-qawli wal-amal," that knowledge is before statement and action. All right, so make sure that you guys read up on on these matters. Read those statements of those scholars who've mentioned these ahkam in even more detail. Right? Of course, we don't have all of the time to talk about each and every single small detail of these matters, but these are just some principles that we can understand. All right, so that's a very important point, and that is that we take the advice of medical professionals. All right, now one thing that I do want to mention as well is that when it comes to tawakkul, right, we have to make sure that as Muslims we have a proper understanding of tawakkul. How do we understand having trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these times, right? Especially when it comes to taking precautions, right? Do we take our precautions, or do we just have tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Do we say that we trust Allah azza wa jal, or do we we take all of the precautions that are necessary? All right. Now there are several different approaches to this. One approach is that we can basically say that we're going to put our trust in Allah and we're not going to take any precautions. But of course, this is not the correct one. All right, this is not the correct one. When we want money from our jobs, we go out to work, right? We take the means to fulfill whatever we want, and at the same time we have tawakkul. So saying that we should just have tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, have trust in Allah without doing the means, this is of course something that is mistaken. All right. Another approach is, for example, some people they only take the means, right? They only take the means. They take all of the necessary measures to fulfill whatever goal they want, but then they forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is can even be a form of shirk, right? A form of associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it is only Allah azza wa jal that decrees things to happen. And if someone believes that things can happen and I could just basically take all of the means that I want to take and then things will come into fruition just because of those means alone and not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then this is a big problem in Iman. All right, and the scholars mentioned that this can be a form of shirk as well. So we have to realize that whatever precautions we take, whatever measures we take, they're only effective by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission. All right, so the correct approach when it comes to tawakkul is that we take as much precautions as we can, right? We take as much precautions as we can, right? To protect ourselves, to protect our families from this virus. And I'm talking about washing your hands, right? I'm talking about wiping things down, making sure that you're staying indoors. Whatever advice that our authorities have given us, we're making sure that we're taking all of those steps. And at the same time, we understand that nothing can happen except by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission. Right? Nothing can happen except by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's leave. So that being said, is the correct approach that we take a little bit of steps, take a little bit of those measures and means, and then we have a little bit of tawakkul? Is that a balance? No. We have to take as much precautions as we can, right? And then have as much tawakkul as we can, have as much trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as we can. And this is all based upon the hadith of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where a man asked the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that, "O Messenger of Allah, should I have tawakkul in Allah, or should I tie my camel and have tawakkul in Allah?" Now, a lot of people, they say this statement. They say, "Tie your camel, brother," or "Tie your camel, sister." Where does that come from? It comes from this hadith right here. This hadith is in the Sunan. A man, he asked the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that question. Now, why would he ask about a camel? During their times, when you have someone who is herding camel, someone who is taking care of camels, camels were notorious for running away. So what they would do is that they would tie, or they would hobble the leg of the camel, one of the legs of the camel, so that the camel will not be able to run away. All right. So when the camel is in that state, it's not able to run away. So this man who's herding, he's taking care of these camels, he asked Allah's Messenger that, he wants his camels to stay put. And anybody would. You would lose money if the camels run away. He wants his camels to stay put. So he says, "O Messenger of Allah, should I just have tawakkul in Allah, just have trust in Allah that my camels will stay put? Or should I tie my camel as well as having trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?" And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that tie the camel wa tawakkul ala Allah. And have tawakkul ala Allah, right? Have the trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this story of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam serves as a basis of how we should understand tawakkul, right? We should not say, for example, that we only have fear for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we don't have fear for anything else, right? Rather, if there's nothing wrong, and sometimes it's necessary to have natural fear, right? Sometimes if you don't have fear of natural things in the world, for example, you don't fear falling off a ledge. Perhaps you may be too lackadaisical and then you fall off, right? So there's nothing wrong with having natural fear, and sometimes it's necessary, right, to prevent certain harms from taking place. So we have to realize that there's no contradiction between having a fear of this virus, like a rational fear where you take precautions. There's no contradiction between that and having tawakkul in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or having fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those two things can come together, and they should, because this is something that's very serious. And we should all take this matter very serious. Make sure that we're taking as much precautions as we can. Unfortunately, sometimes we may, if you're driving in the street, sometimes, you see groups of people congregating together. This is something that we should avoid as Muslims, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to stay away from that harm. Stay away from, killing yourselves and to throwing yourselves into destruction. Of course, most people recover from this. But who knows? Perhaps the people that are passing away. If you look at the numbers, if you look at at the statistics, it's not just the older people that are passing away from this. All right, it's younger people as well. It's people that have perhaps someone has a pre-existing condition they're not fully aware of, and that affects the advancement of this disease. We ask Allah Subhanahu wa Taala to protect all of us, but this is something that we should be very, very careful about, right? And as I said, we should look up what the authorities have given us in terms of advice, and we should be following that, inshallah ta'ala. All right, now the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, just to give you some more details about taking precautions, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says in a hadith in Bukhari, he says, "Firra min al-majdhumi kama tafirru min al-asad." The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam he said, run away and flee from the person who is afflicted with leprosy, the same way that you would run away from a lion. Did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he did not tell us that we should say that we put our trust in Allah and we go around people that are contagious. No, right? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that run away from the leper, run away, flee from the person who is afflicted with leprosy, the same way that you would run away from a lion. Why? Because both of the harms are possible, right? We know that if we're chilling around a lion, anybody with any sense is gonna try to be away from there as much as possible, try to run away. And anyone who's around someone who has a contagious disease should run away as well, should try to distance themselves as much as possible. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he even taught us about social distancing. There's one narration where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was talking to a man about camels who are sick. Right? Sometimes a person who has sick camels, if he brings those sick camels and he allows those camels to be around healthy camels, the healthy camels become sick. So in one hadith in Sahih Muslim, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he narrates that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he said, "La yuridu mumridun ala musih," that a person with sick camels should not bring his camels to a person who has healthy camels. Why? Because the disease will spread. So if this is the case with camels and animals, right? What about us as human beings, right? The same principle applies, right? That if there's someone who is sick, then try to stay away from the person that is healthy. And one of the other things that our medical authorities have advised us with is that this disease can be within a person. A person can actually be sick with this, infected with this disease, and the signs of sickness don't even show up to perhaps 2 weeks. So, for example, I could be carrying around the virus and I feel as healthy as a horse. And I'm going around to people, I'm shaking people's hands, I'm hugging people, I'm going to visit this one and that one. And then when they tell me to stay away from them, I say, oh, I'm not sick, right? I'm not sick, right? Rather, what we should do is, the authorities have advised us that everyone should deal with others as if they are sick, right? As if they are sick. And this is to prevent that, the spread of this disease. All right? So I hope that everything was clear, inshallah ta'ala. I believe that we have some questions here. All right? And if you guys have any questions, you can post those questions, inshallah ta'ala. All right, so, all right, let's see what questions that we have here. All right, so this is, a sister mentions, Assalamu alaikum, they had a video that they put dirt on the bag as tayammum. Okay, so Allahu alam, if there's any scholars that have mentioned that you put dirt on a bag. So I think the sisters, I think it's the same video that I've seen as well, that they actually put they put the dirt on top of the sealed bag. This is not something that's necessary, right? Tayammum, the dirt has to come in contact with the skin of the person, right? And if that's not possible, it's not necessary to do tayammum over a bag where it's completely sealed. Okay, so the scholars have mentioned in a situation like that, if tayammum is not like if it's not possible for it to be done, the person is just buried in the state that they are. Sometimes you may find some people, and perhaps they're following another view, for example, and they're basically putting the dirt on top of the body. Allahu alam of any other views of scholars. But in matters like this, perhaps it could be subject to ijtihad of scholars, and you may find that there are some other views. And we have to realize that we shouldn't jump to attacking people and to saying that this one is doing this and this one is doing that. In matters of difference of opinion, And I'm not saying that this was definitely a matter of difference of opinion. I'm saying perhaps there's some other views of scholars. There's a principle that the scholars mention, and that is that لا إنكار في مسائل الاجتهاد, that there is no inkar, there is no rebuking, right, or putting people down or attacking people, right? That should not be done in matters of ijtihad, matters of difference of opinion, right? Valid difference of opinion where the scholars differ as to how to deal with a new scenario, for example, right? We should be very tolerant when it comes to these matters, all right? Because they may do the same to us, and that wouldn't be fair, okay? So as I said, the view that I've heard from the scholars is that this is something that is not necessary to actually put dirt on top of a sealed bag. It's not even coming in contact with the person. So the tayammum, perhaps they're doing it for peace of mind. Perhaps they're doing it to be on the safe side. Allahu alam, why exactly why people may be doing this, but Allah Subhanahu wa Taala knows best. But as I mentioned, it's not necessary. We have another question. So passed away overseas, can we take the body to their home country? Okay, so Allahu alam. I think that in this situation, definitely, I'm pretty sure that the medical authorities would have something to say about that. There's already travel restrictions going on. A lot of countries are basically closing their borders, not allowing anybody to travel. So to think of a country allowing a body that's been, infected, perhaps they may have some new guidelines in regards to that, right? But this is a matter, generally speaking, a person should be buried in where they die, right? To be moving bodies here and there and to be moving them around is not something that should be done. A person should be buried where they pass away, all right? And Allah Subhanahu wa Taala knows best. All right, next question. So can we have a mini Jumu'ah at home? All right, so that's a very good question. All right, so is it permissible for us to have a mini Jumu'ah at home? We know that most masjids, I believe all masjids have closed down their Jumu'ah services. So in the situation like that, do we pray Jumu'ah at home? If there's a man and a woman, if there's a husband and wife at home and they have a few kids, can they basically make their own Jumu'ah salah? All right, so this in this particular issue, there's a few things that we have to consider. Number one, the scholars have different opinions as to how many people is necessary for there to be present for Jumu'ah to even be valid in the first place. There's many scholars. Some scholars have a certain number of people that have to be present so that Jumu'ah can even be valid in the first place. And they say that if there are just a few people, then it would not be valid. So that's the first issue, and that is the amount of people that must be taken into consideration. The second thing that we have to take into consideration is it even permissible to do Salat al-Jumu'ah in a place that's not a masjid? This is another mas'ala that the scholars have ikhtilaf in. All right? And another issue is, furthermore, praying it in the house. Is that even permissible? So what you will find is that there's many scholars who advise not to pray in the homes. That defeats the purpose of the Jumu'ah. The Jumu'ah is to gather the people together. And of course, if people start to have Jumu'ahs in their homes, then perhaps this will lead to a lot of people be like, oh, we're going to have like an underground Jumu'ah. The masjids are closed off. Let's have this, like an underground Jumu'ah. Everybody come over to my house and we'll have a big Jumu'ah in my house. And then this further leads to the spread of this disease. So that's why many scholars, especially the scholars in those countries where, Muslim countries, where they have basically banned the Jumu'ah prayers to protect the health of the people, they advise that what a person should be doing is that they should pray Dhuhr inside of their home. Many scholars mention that if someone is excused from Jumu'ah, none of them mention that a person should then have another Jumu'ah in their home. A person is sick, he's staying home, he should pray Salat al-Jumu'ah inside of his house with his other family members who are there, right? So looking at these are all things that we must consider. The number of people, we must consider, can we even pray inside of the house in the first place? So these are just matters for us to think about. And as I mentioned, there's many scholars who say that it should not be done inside of the home. And that's the view that inshallah ta'ala is the correct one, right? It should not be done inside of the home. Rather, what a person should be doing is praying, they should be praying Salatul Dhuhr, right? So every Friday pray Salat al-Dhuhr. But of course, a lot of the benefits of Jum'ah are still there. Sending Salat upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Reading Surah Al-Kahf, according to those scholars who deem those hadiths as authentic, right? Um, and whatever else that the other virtuous acts of Jumu'ah can be done as well. All right, so so try to do those things as well. Don't abandon everything from Yom Jumu'ah. All right. So what else do we have? We have some more questions as well. All right. When there's no space, can we bury Muslims in a non-Muslim? Can we bury Muslims in a non-Muslim cemetery? We've mentioned that those scholars who mentioned. In fact, all of the scholars mentioned, that there's some ijma' on this. There's a consensus on this that Muslims must be buried in the graveyard of Muslims. But if there's a situation of necessity, where there's no space, for example, the graveyards are just so overcrowded, so many people are being buried there, subhanallah. What do we do in a scenario like that? The scholars have mentioned if it's a situation of necessity, they can be buried in the graveyard of non-Muslims. And perhaps if they if they can make a section for Muslims, then of course that's best. All right. Let's see. We have another question. Can we cremate bodies so that they don't infect others? Allahu alam. I mean, look, as long as the authorities have not said that they need to be cremated to protect people's health, then from a medical perspective, if it's not necessary from a medical perspective, then it's not going to be necessary from an Islamic perspective. As I mentioned, all of the ahkam of the janazah, prayer, the shrouding, the washing, everything should be kept the same as long as it doesn't lead to any harm. The only reason why people are making changes, right, to the janazah rites is because of the advice of the authorities, and that is to prevent harm, right? So we look at what the authorities tell us. If they tell us that is going to lead to to harm, which Allahu alam, I don't think they have done yet, then we keep burying the Muslims, right? The way that our deen expects of us, right? Or the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects of us. All right. So we can't just cremate bodies just because we have an irrational fear that they're going to infect people, right? So hopefully that's clear. All right. So let's see. What other questions do we have? Okay. So can we just do a khutbah and live stream it on Facebook and pray Dhuhr? Okay. So this is a very good question. What's happening is that we're finding that there are some masjids, some Islamic centers. Every Friday they're having sort of like a Jumu'ah, right? But it's not really a Jumu'ah. It's basically just a reminder so that people have something. A lot of people rely on the Jumu'ah khutbah for their weekly reminders. And I'm sure that we're all feeling this, that we're so used to going for Jumu'ah, we're not getting those great reminders. What should we do in that scenario? So some masjids, they've come up with this idea of broadcasting some sort of lecture, some beneficial sermon so that the people can benefit from that. There's nothing wrong with listening to these lectures, listening to these reminders. There's nothing wrong with that, right? In fact, these are things that should be encouraged, right? To spread reminders and to actually give people something that they're missing, right? But however, you don't pray Salat al-Jum'ah at home, right? There's no virtual Jum'ah, right? You pray Salat al-Dhuhr in your house, all right? You pray Salat al-Dhuhr in your house as you would normally do any other day. Hopefully that's clear. Also, we have another question. Let's see. Okay, very good question. Are people who pass away from this sickness, are they considered shuhada? Is someone who dies from the coronavirus considered a shaheed? Very good question. I've seen a lot of debate about this, right? People are saying, no, this is not a... First of all, we have a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he tells us that al-mat'unu shaheed. The one who dies of a plague is a shaheed. So if someone dies of a ta'un, of a plague, Islamically, they get the reward of a shaheed. Of course, all of the other ahkam apply to them normally. They have to be washed and everything. All right? And they're buried as a normal Muslim. But in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they get the reward of a shaheed. And we can't, pinpoint any particular person and say this person is a shaheed and this person is not a shaheed. Rather, we should say that we hope that they are shuhada. All right? So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? This whole issue hinges on hadiths like this, where he tells us that the person who dies from a plague is a shaheed. So the question is the coronavirus a plague? That's the question. And the scholars have different opinions. You'd be surprised the amount of scholars that say that a person who dies from any type of epidemic, that counts as them dying from a ta'un. All of this goes back to what is considered a ta'un. What is considered a plague? In the English language, we translate the word ta'un as plague, right? But is ta'un only a plague, right? Is ta'un only a plague, or can it be applied to any disease that spreads quickly? Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, many scholars, in fact, Ibn Uthaymeen in his explanation of Riyadh al-Salihin, he says that a ta'un is kullu waba'in yantashiru bisur'ah. And many other, I believe Ibn al-Athir mentions this as well, other scholars, they say that a ta'un can be considered any type of epidemic that spreads quickly. Any epidemic that causes death and it spreads quickly can be considered a ta'un. Other scholars say no. An-Nawawi, I believe Ibn al-Qayyim, Ibn Hajar, they say no. Ta'un specifically refers to that bacterial disease that causes like ulcers on your body, like the bubonic plague, for example. There's a group of scholars, they say the ta'un is specifically that disease, and you can't say the coronavirus is that disease. All right? Whereas you have other scholars that say that no, a ta'un is any disease. It's not just a plague like the bubonic plague, for example. Right? So there's some difference of opinion on this matter, and as I've mentioned, this is a matter of interpretation here. It's a matter of ijtihad. And we should not be attacking people who take another view. Sometimes we look at the English translation of the word ta'un and we say, oh, that's a plague, and this is not a plague, so therefore we attack other Muslims who say that that this is a plague. Rather, no, right? This is a matter of difference of opinion. And what it seems like there, is that opinion that every disease that spreads quickly can be considered a ta'un. That seems to be correct, as many scholars have mentioned, like Ibn Uthaymeen and others, rahimahumullah. All right, and there's even some scholars who say that any type of death that's similar to the death of a mat'un, any type of death that's similar to the death of someone who dies of plague, a very severe death that causes a lot of pain, a lot of suffering in that death, in the way that the person has died, then they get the reward of shaheed, and this is hope for them as well. All right, so I want to establish that this is a matter of scholarly difference, and we should be tolerant when it comes to this issue. And we hope that those Muslims that have passed away, that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala rewards them with the reward of the shuhada. And Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is more merciful to us than we think, than we would be to ourselves. All right, we have some more questions as well. Can we pray with a mask on? So there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ forbids from a person to pray with kind of like like their face covered, for example, right? But in a situation where a person feels like the disease is going to spread to them, they're in a public place, for example. If you're by yourself and there's no need to wear the mask, don't wear the mask. But if you're in a public setting and you feel that it's through whatever contact to the ground or whatever, for example, it's going to come to you, then in that situation, if you're doing it to protect your health out of necessity, then there's nothing wrong with that. All right, moving on. So can people who are sick recite the dhikr with their hearts only, or has to move the lips? So dhikr can be done with the heart, dhikr can be done with the tongue, but many scholars mention that the best dhikr is the dhikr that is done with the tongue and the heart. So if someone is in a situation where they're too sick to move the tongue, to even speak the adhkar, then they could do it in their heart, and of course that will be acceptable, inshallah ta'ala. Wallahu a'lam. We have another question. Does praying in jama'ah at home have the same virtue with doing it in the masjid? There's a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he tells us that when the slave of Allah becomes sick or when he travels, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes down for him the same deeds that he would normally be doing if he was at home, in other words, not traveling, or he was healthy and not sick. All right, so that being said, inshallah ta'ala, those who are consistently going for the Salatul Jama'ah, you're getting your reward. All right, you're getting your reward. If there's anyone that would normally go to the masjids and you're attached to the masjid, you're getting that reward, inshallah ta'ala. All right, based on hadiths like this. So having Jama'ah at home, does it have the same virtue of doing it in the masjid? Allahu a'lam. Allahu a'lam. But it's definitely better than praying by yourself. All right, it's definitely better than praying by yourself, and inshallah ta'ala the reward will be there, because the person is not praying at home because they want to pray at home, but it's due to a situation of necessity. All right. So also we're going to stop for Maghrib in a bit. I want to just alert you guys that there are some members of our own community that are suffering from this disease. This is not something that is foreign, right? Members of our own community, our masjid, are being affected by this disease, and some of them are sick right now. Some of them are in the hospital with ventilators. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them shifa. Ameen. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it a means of purification of them from all of their sins. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He grant them the reward of the shuhada, those of them that have passed away, and those of them who are patient. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He make it easy for their families, and they allow all of their needs to be met. Ameen. And if you guys know of anyone in this situation that needs help, make sure that you're trying to reach out to them and trying to help them out in whatever way possible, whether it's a delivery or anything else. We have to try to to basically benefit the community as much as we can as Muslims. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make that easy for us. I mean, so as I mentioned, there's a brother right now who's in intensive care right now, and this brother is an active member of our community, mashallah. And we know this brother, mashallah, to be someone that would always, anything that would need to be done, this brother, mashallah, would help out, whether it's financial or whether it's showing up or whatever the case is. So we have brothers and sisters in our community that are being faced with this. And as I mentioned, there's one brother that is facing this. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give him shifa. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for all of the brothers and sisters going through this. So we're going to stop here, inshallah ta'ala. I believe that's all of the questions that we have. Hopefully we all benefited. Alhamdulillah, was a great reminder for myself. Hopefully it was for you as well. Jazakumullah khairan for joining us. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.